Yeah, hello everybody. This is Wendt speaking. I'm currently in Düsseldorf, and yes, we are hosting this webinar today with masVenta Business GmbH. And what you can see on the screen is the European Business Analysis Day. This is what we are hosting as well, and we are waiting for Adrian Reed. Adrian Reed will give us some insights into stakeholder management, especially tricky stakeholders we will discuss. And Adrian is currently gearing up with notebook and his PC. So it takes a minute, but that is not the problem because that's for the benefit of the people who are coming a bit late. So let's wait another 1, 2, 3 minutes, 1, 2 minutes probably to have Adrian ready and to have the people who are coming late ready. This webinar will be recorded, and you can finally stream this or download this, whatever you want. And most probably we are putting it as well on YouTube. So I see people are coming in, so it's always a good idea to start a bit later and exactly on the point. So yeah, let me use this introduction to do a bit of advertisement. What you can see on the screen is an advertisement for the European Business Analysis Day, a conference for business analysis, which we are hosting with masVenta. We are hosting it for the third time this year, 14th and 15th of May 2020. 14th will be the workshop day and 15 is the conference day. And of course everybody is asking, what is about Corona? Is Corona causing this conference to be postponed, or are you canceling the conference, or whatever? And until now, until today, we are not planning to cancel the conference. Contrarily, we are really making our homework, meaning we have questionnaires, we have interviews, and we do not let people book for the conference who come from China, South Korea, Iran, or Italy. And we are very carefully checking which people are coming, who's coming, and whether these people have been in these regions, in the let's say hotspots of the coronavirus. Of course, we know that as well in Europe, there are some hotspots like Italy, and this is why we are very strict in allowing people from Italy or from the other dangerous countries to join. Whenever you have questions, you can ask these questions right now, or you can ask these questions even if you write an email to me. And I hope to see a lot of you in the in Frankfurt at the European Business Analysis Day. So we are still waiting for Adrian. He is coming, and tricky stakeholders is something which is probably something everybody has problems with sometimes, and even joy and fun. And tricky stakeholders can be the success factor of a project. And this is why we really have to observe. We have to understand stakeholders, and we have to have a kind of tailored approach to each and every single stakeholder. You should never ever think of too much of groups. So the end users or operations or whatsoever, because this can quickly be dangerous. Because you think that all people from the end users are thinking on the same lines, and this can be very different. Okay, so we have 4 minutes after 4, and I would say we could start when Adrian joins the webinar. I had him on the line already, and I see that he's coming again. And so we say hello to Adrian. Adrian, can you hear us? I think he's switching on his mic and his camera soon. from the UK, Adrian Reed. He speaks in a lot of conferences, and we have met in America actually, in Orlando. He was speaking, I was speaking there on the building business capabilities. And what I could really recommend is Adrian has written 2 books, but he will probably tell you on his own. You can find his books at Amazon, and it's worth to read them. Adrian, can you hear us?
I can hear. I can't see you, and I know that it's not getting my webcam to work, but I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, so that's good. Of course, it's not good that the webcam isn't working, but of course, probably the slides you're presenting and your voice are even more important.
Yes,
yes, and this is why I would ask you to take over control, so you can become the presenter now. I think this can be switched by you, or I can even make you the presenter.
Okay, so let me. Now it's just 1 second. I'm needing a Chrome extension to do this, so
yeah. So I can see that you have been that you are the presenter now, and okay, perfect. So yes, we can see your screen,
and you can just see the slides, right? You can see the title.
We can just see the slide. I already introduced you a little bit while you were rebooting and gearing up. And,
yes.
So then I would do a quick handover. I already told the people about the European Business Analysis Day, and so I don't want to take more time. So it's your show, Adrian. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you, Rainer, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in. And apologies for the slight technical difficulties. These things always happen, even with the best made plans. These things always happen from time to time. So, as Rainer mentioned, my name is Adrian Reed. My topic today is whose perspective is it anyway? Practical techniques for understanding tricky stakeholders. Because one thing that probably unites us, I think, whether you're a business analyst, a project manager, whether you're working in the public sector, the private sector, consulting, whatever, we all get to work with stakeholders. And it's probably fair to say that everyone on this webinar, or even if you're watching the recording, we all deal with tricky stakeholders from time to time. And you may well be dealing with a tricky stakeholder on your project right now. But it's interesting, isn't it? We talk a lot about stakeholders. We don't talk so much about stakes. And if we were to flip things around, well, maybe sometimes when we're looking at a stakeholder and saying they're being tricky, maybe they're looking at us thinking, well, that's a really tricky BA or a really tricky PM or a really tricky change practitioner. You know, they didn't engage me well. They didn't engage me early enough. And so now I'm not bought into the project, the program, or the initiative. And maybe if we talk about stakes as much as we talked about stakeholders, maybe that would give us a different perspective on how to engage the people who are affected by our changes. So that's the topic of the talk today. The talk's in 2 main parts. I'm going to start by telling you a bit of a story about an example of where stakeholder perspectives clashed and it really didn't work out quite so well. Now that story is going to sound a bit curveball, so strap yourself in, but it is relevant, I promise. That'll take about 10 minutes. But then I want to get to the meat of the presentation, and we'll spend about 20 minutes, half an hour, going through a range of techniques. We'll only go through each technique briefly, but there's loads more out there on the web, or if you contact me, I can send you suggested reading and so on.
Great.
So we'll start with this crazy story, and it's actually a story about me, or specifically about my car. And I've never been I don't like driving. I've never liked driving. And I also have no idea how cars work. I mean, I know conceptually how they work. I know how to drive a car. I've never had any interest in understanding how engines work. So for this reason, I do what I suspect most of us do every year. I take my car into a local mechanic, a garage, and I have a service to make sure it's safe, to change the oil, and do the kind of preventative maintenance that is so important. And when I last took my car to have it serviced, I went to the same place I always do. They have a fantastic online booking system, and I was a stakeholder of that process. I went online, I booked, I paid, and there was a discount for paying in advance. I booked the day I wanted. Fantastic, a flawless online experience. Mm-hmm. I then arrive at the mechanic's garage, and the first thing I noticed is there was a big line, a queue of people outside the office. And so I queue up, and I can see the people on reception are really struggling. And it looks like there's been a new IT system installed. And whatever has been installed isn't working for them as stakeholders, because they're reverting back to using a paper diary. I get to the front of the queue, and I explain I've booked online, and they say, oh, no, the interface to the online front end is down. We haven't got your booking. We'll fit you in. And whilst that was great, it didn't fill me with confidence that they were going to kind of fit me in. So I was having a really curious experience as a stakeholder. And I was thinking about them as stakeholders, because they've had this IT system imposed on them that doesn't actually meet their needs and requirements. So I go home, I'm working from home that day, and thinking about all these stakeholder ideas, and then I get a phone call. There's some work that needs doing on the car, I authorise it, and then at the end of the day I get the call that no car owner ever really wants to receive. It's the regional manager rings me, and the first words he says to me are, I've got some bad news, we've made a mistake. Now again, in terms of stakeholders, I think this manager assumed I knew about cars, because I'll explain what he said, and if you know anything about cars, you'll probably have a sharp intake of breath at this point, but I had no idea the gravity of what he was telling me. So he says, one of the things we had to do was change your water pump because your water pump was leaking. In order to do that, the mechanic had to change the timing belt, but the mechanic made a mistake in the tension of the timing belt. When the ignition was then subsequently turned, there was a loud bang, and we need to investigate how much damage we've done. And we'll fix it, but we need to investigate. Now, I had no idea what that meant. So I just said, fine. And to their credit, they went about fixing the issue, but it took, from a stakeholder perspective, much longer than I was expecting. So after one week, they called me and said, we've got a scope down in your, we've opened the head, whatever the head is. We've got a scope down there, and we can see that 8 of the 16 valves are bent. Again, that doesn't sound like good news to me, but it just was. 2 weeks come, they have to rebuild the engine, send it on for pressure testing. And anyway, four weeks later, they're ready. And I go back, I turn the key in the ignition, and actually as a stakeholder, I'm reasonably happy because it purrs like a new car. Largely, I now understand, because they've pretty much rebuilt the entire engine. But I have to go straight out of the garage and straight back, because when I look down at my speedometer, it looks like this. Okay, which, if you're perceptive in the audience there, you'll see us stuck at 230 kilometers an hour with the parking brake on. And as much as I loved my car, it was a 2007 Fiesta 1.1. It couldn't do 230 kilometers an hour, certainly not with the parking brake on. So again, they fix it, they fit me in, and I drive the car away. But I never really trusted the car again, because I didn't really know what was wrong with it. And I never really had it explained to me. And there was all this mismatch of stakeholders' views clashing. Anyway, I'm down the pub with a friend about a week later, and I was explaining this to him, and as soon as I said the timing belt slipped, he was like, whoa, that's huge.
Yes.
And he was telling me that the amount of work they would have done would have cost the garage, because apparently it's very specialist work, it would have cost them thousands and thousands of euros, thousands and thousands of pounds. And he said to me, how much is your car worth? And I said, it's a 2007 Fiesta. On a good day, maybe £500–600, you know, €600–700, something like that. It's an old car. And I thought it was a real shame, because had I made my stakeholder needs known better, had they sought to understand them better, maybe we could have come up with a better solution for them and for me.
Yeah.
Now the irony was that about a few weeks later, there was a braking system failure, which was so dangerous I wasn't happy to drive the car or sell it. So I scrapped it, and I got the princely sum of £135 for the car. After the garage had spent thousands on putting a new engine in, so whoever got the engine from that scrap car got a very good deal. And I was thinking about this as the car was being taken away on the transporter, and I was thinking it's a real shame that I wasn't able to get my stakeholder needs across. And I was thinking about the different stakeholders and how the IT system had been imposed, which had put the garage staff under pressure because they were getting people turning up they weren't expecting. And that was meaning that they were having to rush things, and they rushed things, so they got the timing belt wrong. So they created another issue for themselves, and it was like a feedback loop. It's like firefighting. And although probably no one on this webinar works for a garage, well, maybe they do, but probably not. But we've probably all been in situations where stakeholder needs aren't properly understood, where there are misaligned views, or where change is imposed and people are just expected to work within it. And that's the kind of thing that we can avoid as analysts, as change practitioners. And when thinking about stakeholders, I mean, we often think about like the project sponsor, you know, an important, crucial stakeholder. And we may well use a technique like personas. And, you know, if anyone listening isn't familiar with personas, it's a great technique. You take an archetypal type of user or stakeholder or customer or whatever. And personas are great when they're based on data or insight, or at least a hypothesis. But I think the danger that we all intuitively know, but it's worth putting into words, is sometimes personas are based on what someone reckons. And if we build services, processes off the back of what someone reckons, without any data or insight, what we end up doing inadvertently is creating a sort of vanilla, an average process that works for every average and vanilla person. But of course, in reality, nobody's average. It meets nobody's needs. It's just a vanilla average thing. And then what we end up doing inadvertently is saying to people who come and use the process, service, system or whatever, well, sorry, sir, you're an edge case. Like, you know, I'm an edge case going to the garage because I don't know about cars. But really, am I? Isn't that the main reason that at least some people go? So if we don't understand the motivations of our stakeholders, our users, their perspectives, then we risk delivering stuff that doesn't work. So let's play with a persona just for fun. Let's imagine this is Bernard. It's a stock photo. It's not really Bernard, but it could be. And let's imagine Bernard is in his early 70s. And unfortunately, Bernard was about 10 years ago diagnosed with early onset dementia. A particular flavour of dementia that Bernard unfortunately has is a mixture of Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. And this means he can't remember passwords or pins. It also means when he rings up, he appears very forgetful. And he raises queries that might seem odd to those who are receiving the call. Also, it means that sometimes his family have to manage his affairs using a power of attorney. Mm-hmm. Now, when was the last time Like, you know, I can count on my one hand the number of times I've seen a persona for Bernard or Bernadette or whoever. But, you know, we've got more and more people living in our society who need to access services differently. And most financial services processes are almost built, you couldn't design them more inconveniently for someone like Bernard, because everything is online with passwords and pins, and it's tricky. So I think it is also, and this is a personal but very firmly held opinion, that we have an ethical imperative to understand groups of users, of stakeholders who might not be being represented, because they are important, valuable people as well. So what I want to do now is move on and talk through some techniques. And this part of the presentation is chunked into 3 parts. I'll talk about stakeholders and stakes. We'll look at a traditional stakeholder approach and some slightly different ones there. I then want to talk about stakeholder perspectives and share a technique or two on those. And then finally, very, very briefly at the end, I'll talk about zooming out and how we might talk about or how we might make decisions on what we actually mean by engagement. So, first of all, stakeholders and stakes. Well, when I say stakeholder analysis, probably most of us think of the classic stakeholder grid. And there are many versions. This is just one. This is adapted from IIBA's Business Analysis Body of Knowledge Guide. Very, very good reference. If anyone listening in hasn't come across that, it's well worth, if you're a member, you can download it for free. It's excellent. And this is where you look at somebody's influence, the impact a problem is having on them, or a change would have, and it gives you different approximate engagement approaches or communication approaches. And it's really useful because, you know, you take a stakeholder and you might say, well, you know, actually, my stakeholder Ravi, well, Ravi is very impacted and very influential, so he's up there. Mm-hmm. Except for the scanning and workflow element of the project where he's here. And for the non-functionals, he's here, and then he's somewhere else for a different part of the project, and that's useful. But then we add other stakeholders, and all of a sudden, it's very, very busy. It's like a fly swatter. It's like we've swatted our stakeholders on a fly swatter. And so that can be an issue with this approach. So the other issue for me is the bottom right-hand corner, which is those who are most impacted but not influential are just keep informed. And we probably all know, everyone listening into this knows that we often need to be a bit more proactive with those people because they're highly affected by the change. So this is an excellent technique, but there are other techniques we can use as well as or instead of this. And the first one turns this approach on its head. It's really quite similar, just laid out differently. And it's known as the stakeholder rainbow. And with the stakeholder rainbow, we've got 2 dimensions, really. So what you've got is, you can see you've got influence along the left to right, so most influential on the left, moderate and least on the right. And then the bands, the colours of the rainbow are on how affected someone is. So if someone isn't very affected, they're on the outer shell. They're distanced from the centre. If they're very affected, they're in the middle. They're close to the core of the rainbow. And this looks very similar, but whenever I've used this, and I have no idea why, there must be a psychological reason why, it drives different discussions. And I find I get a wider group of stakeholders identified and talked about. And what else I've noticed, and you know, everyone tuned in may well find this too, but in many situations, you've got somebody over here who's not very influential but very affected. This might be the branch staff, the receptionist in the mechanic's garage, who are affected by a new system. And they're unhappy because the decision's made up here by someone who's very influential but never actually uses the system or the process or the service. And different stakeholders on different positions have different aspirations. So the smiling person here, they might be a sponsor, they might be looking at return on investment or finance or something like that. Whereas the people down here who are most affected, they probably just want services and processes and systems that are easy to use and reliable and quick. So the people within that red line there often have very similar types of aspirations, even if irrespective of their level of influence. So it's important that they're represented, even if they're not very influential. So that addresses the issue of the bottom right-hand corner being just keep informed. It helps drive, or I've found it helps drive different discussions about how we might engage. But it doesn't solve the problem of the fly swatter, the fact that we've got different stakeholders in different positions. So another technique I'll talk about briefly is the Stakeholder Interest Intensity Index. And what we do with this is we take a stakeholder and we think about an area of the project, of the change, of the problem, of whatever we're working on. And we give them a score of vested interest and influence. And you ideally want to use 1 to 5. So if someone was, say, very, very interested but not very influential, they'd be a 5/1. If they were moderately interested, they might be a 3/1 or whatever. So that sounds a bit abstract, so let's look at an example. Here you can see we have our areas of interest. So I've made these up, but you get the idea. We've got scanning and workflow, online portal, and so on. We've got the different stakeholder groups, and we've got a vested interest and influence score. So here you can see the call centre are very interested in scanning and workflow, but not very influential, as an example. And, this is interesting, but it's still quite hard to read. So there's a sort of magic formula that comes with this approach, which looks, if you're not very mathematically minded, it looks complicated, but you can plug it into Excel, and the formula is the square root of v times I over 25. What this does is it creates a single index, a single number between 0 and 1, between 0 and 1, which, because it's normalized, even if someone is low influence but they are high interest, they will still get a moderately high score, so they don't get lost. What this creates is a table that looks like this, which again, you're probably looking at it thinking, well, it's interesting, but still not very actionable, still not very, there's still more that can be done. But with a bit of processing in Excel, or you can do this manually, you think you've got relative numbers there. Well, you're just one step away from having a heat map. And heat maps are great for creating conversations. Everyone in projects seems to love heat maps. And here you can see, for example, that scanning and workflow, when we were working on that part of the project, was customers probably aren't going to care. They just care about the outcome. But the call centre are really, really key to speak to. When it comes to online invoices, we absolutely got to speak to the finance team. So it helps us tailor the types of communication and engagement, and when we engage. The thing about communication seems to be that, like, too much communication too often is probably just as bad as not enough, because people tune out. So, moving on to talk about perspectives. So we talked about stakeholders, we talked about stakes a little bit, we talked about building it for Bernard or Bernadette, understanding that people have different needs and aspirations. We've talked about the fly swatter, the impact interest grid, perhaps using a stakeholder rainbow, and the vested interest intensity index. So I want to move on now and talk about perspectives. And everyone that's attending this live, or even if you're watching a recording, I'm going to put a question up on the screen. And I want you to just like write down, your response to this question, and don't overthink it. Like, come up with your first answer. So I'll explain the question. And the question is, what is the parking enforcement service for? And if you're not familiar with what I mean by the parking enforcement service, I mean those lovely ladies and gents who put these parking fines on your windshield, on your windscreen of your car, if you park somewhere that you shouldn't. And if we were running this for real in a room, there'd be all sorts of different answers. And quite typically, there'll be some people that will say, well, parking enforcement is about safety. It's about making sure that, you know, emergency vehicles can get access and the roads aren't congested. Other people might say, well, it's about making money for the government or the municipality or town. Others might say it's about ensuring the law is enforced, and that in itself could be considered a reason. And all of those things are probably true. It's probably a combination of all of those things. But if we have stakeholders who had very different perspectives on what the thing we're working on is for, then we're going to have conflict. And you can end up having conflict where they seem to agree on a surface level, but beneath it there's this conflict bubbling up. So a technique we can use for articulating or analysing these perspectives, and this next technique for anyone that's interested comes from soft systems methodology, or SSM, by Peter Checkland and his colleagues. It's been around a long time. It's a very solid systems thinking approach. And it's known as a root definition, but the particular flavour we're looking at is called PQR. And the formal elaboration of PQR is do P by Q in order to contribute towards achieving R. Okay. Perhaps a more practical way of writing that for us in a project world is a system to do something by some means in order to contribute towards achieving some ends. So a system to do something by some means in order to contribute towards achieving some ends. And that's, if you think about it, addressing three really important business analysis questions about a service, a product, a process, whatever it happens to be. So when we say system here, we don't mean just IT system. A broader system of interest could be about a process as well. But, you know, a system to do something, that's the what. By some means, that's the how. In order to contribute towards achieving an outcome, that's the why. So we've got the what, how, and the why from a particular. We could use this to, you know, from a particular stakeholder's perspective. So if you think about the parking service, well, two possible stakeholder perspectives might be one. You know, stakeholder A might think, well, you know, the parking enforcement service exists to generate revenue from motorists by diligently issuing tickets. This is in order to contribute towards an overall goal of balancing the city's books. That's the sort of, we might call the cynical capitalist perspective on why this process and service exists. Another person might take the view, well, actually, it's to keep road users safe by providing useful information and education in order to contribute towards achieving safe and uncongested roads. Now, the actual parking enforcement service might exist for some combination of those two things, but knowing our stakeholders have that difference is really important. And although we're not talking about personas on this webinar, like, think about the vested interest index. Well, you could put a perspective against each one of those. And we're starting to build up some insight on what our stakeholders actually need, what they want, and how we can engage with them. We could go even further, and for each stakeholder group, start to elicit, establish, and discuss what success looks like. And again, this particular way of defining outcomes, the 3 E's comes from Checkland again, from soft systems methodologies. There's a 5 E's version as well. But the 3 E's are efficiency, efficacy. The first E is efficacy, which is how do we know that the short-term problem is solved and the process system, whatever, is doing what it needs to do. Efficiency is about, well, how do we know it's doing it with the least amount of resources? And effectiveness is about, and how do we know it's achieving the long-term strategic goals from a particular perspective? And what's really interesting, this is a personal reflection, but I've found that quite often stakeholders who have different perspectives will agree on the first two, efficacy and efficiency. But it's only when you start to discuss effectiveness that you realise they've got very different aspirations. So if you think back to the two perspectives on the parking service, well, efficacy, both would probably agree, yeah, we need to, accurately issue tickets. We only issue tickets when someone's actually committed a parking breach. Yep, both perspectives would agree with that. Efficiency, they'd agree that we need to be able to do that with the least number of inspectors and the least number, or the fewer, the fewer resources, the better. But they have different views on effectiveness, because if your primary motivation is making money, then arguably you don't care if people are parking incorrectly, you just care about the number of tickets you issue. So you'd almost actually want people to park badly more often to make more money. If you were looking at safety, you'd actually ideally want a situation where you never issued a ticket because everyone was parking so well and so legally. So looking at those long-term effectiveness measures really illuminates differences between our stakeholders.
Yes, there are really conflicting goals now. We really have goals which are in conflict.
Exactly, conflicting goals at a far more fundamental level. And I found this is a tool that can help surface that much earlier, because otherwise projects, the scope creeps. And if we think about combining that with the vested interest index, we talked about adding the perspectives there. If we add the 3 E's, then we've actually got a really rich idea of what our different stakeholder groups are looking for. And it may be different things, but at least we know that, and maybe we can create something that meets all of those goals, or at least we can point out where there's conflict and navigate our way through it. Now, of course, one thing that many people would look at when looking at this slide is say, that makes sense, Adrian, but customers, that's a really broad stakeholder group. We need a much more granular view of, rather than just saying customer, we need to split it by demographic. And absolutely. So taking this approach, we can say, right, okay, how do we slice and divide each one? Is it retail customers versus business customers? Is it some other demographic that's relevant? And you can go and iterate and create that really rich understanding. And it helps us to think about who we engage, when we engage, to avoid stakeholders being tricky because we haven't engaged them at the right sort of time. But what this doesn't do, of course, is resolve any of that conflict. It might highlight it, and knowing there's conflict is an enabler for us to solve it. But there will still be people that see the world in different ways. I think as human beings, it's probably quite natural. And here we've got two people looking at a ball of string, and the person on the left is seeing pink string, the person on the right is seeing red string. And they're both right, but they've only, each of them has only a single piece of the puzzle. And on the type of messy change projects and programs and initiatives that I suspect many of us work on, I sometimes wonder if it feels like, no one of us has the whole puzzle, but between us we might have enough of the pieces to make the thing work. So I want to talk very briefly about a technique known as cognitive mapping, which can help us explore people's different perceptions, their mental models, particularly about a problem situation. And for cognitive mapping, I'll show you an abstract example, then I'll show you a worked example. But the notation is very simple. I mean, this is an example, it's an abstract example, so it hasn't got any real data or information on. But really the only things to note about the notation is an arrow represents causation, or our supposed causation, or factors that make something worse. So here we're saying that the things at the very top are a problem, so X is a problem, X is caused by A, C causes A, and so on. The other part is you've got the 3 dots, the ellipse, and another word after it. And that's what is described as a bipolar construct. What that means, for example, is if X, which is like our negative problem that we're trying to solve, if that was dropping profits, for example, then the Y would be what the stakeholder wants to have instead. So that could be dropping profits, ... raising profits. I've got dropping profits, but I want raising profits. And that sounds like an obvious example, but we might actually speak to another stakeholder who says, well, yeah, I agree dropping profits is a problem, but I don't think we're ever going to get them raising. The market's dying. We just need to level them off or make them drop less slowly. So it creates questions about what different stakeholders actually want to have happen. So here's a very small fragment of a worked example. And this, by the way, this goes well with traditional techniques that we all know and love, like 5 whys and why else. It's a way of drawing five whys in a way, or more than 5 whys often. So here you can see we've got a decreasing customer retention, but the stakeholder wants to maintain a stable level. Why is that? Well, they perceive we've got a decrease in customer satisfaction rather than maintaining a stable level. Why is that? Because we're delivering orders late rather than on time. And then we've got 2 branches. We've got an issue with couriers or delivery firms and an issue with IT. And these things get very, very big, but it's really useful, I think, to create one of these for each stakeholder, because this is like their piece of the puzzle. Everyone's got a slightly different piece of the puzzle. Then, of course, if you've got a different cognitive map for each stakeholder, and these are the kind of things that, we ask the questions in our interviews and with stakeholders anyway, well then, we can actually bring those perspectives together. We've got those individual fragments, we bring them together, overlay them onto what's sometimes called a group map or a strategic map, highlight where they agree and disagree, and actually start to develop a shared understanding. We can then start to even draw boundaries around chains of causation and say, right, well, let's try and fix that. Let's try and experiment. Let's try, maybe if we use better delivery firms, our customers won't be so upset. So let's try it and pilot it and see if it works. So it's a very iterative approach. It fits very well with the ideas of organizational agility, of really understanding root problems, really understanding stakeholder perspectives, trying it, and if it works, amplify it, do more of it. If it doesn't work, put the brakes on, attenuate it. So finally, and briefly, I want to talk about zooming out. And I want to talk very briefly about what we mean by engagement. So this here is a picture of something. And if I were to ask you what it's a picture of, you would probably say a lamppost or a sign. You might notice that it says Portsmouth City Council. Portsmouth is the city I live in the UK. Now this is technically consultation. This is how in the UK local authorities, councils consult with residents. Or more specifically, it's a form of statutory consultation. They have to place notices on lampposts and adverts in newspapers. But you sort of think about that, and my eyesight isn't very good. I find these things very hard to read, and nobody buys newspapers, or certainly very few people that I know buy local newspapers. So you wonder to what extent that consultation is actually effective, and whether it's truly inclusive of the broader community of residents. Now actually, Portsmouth are very good at also putting stuff online, so they've really worked at this. But I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, well, we throw around in the change world words like engagement and consultation, and I thought, well, what do they really mean? And I think it could be argued that there's actually a spectrum. And at one end, there's passive approaches to stakeholder management and engagement. And I can still remember a job I had a fairly long time ago now. I was a junior manager, and the senior manager that I reported to was very clear that my job, when it came to managing my team, was to tell and sell. This senior manager would get a message from a director about a change. He would cascade it down to me. I was not really supposed to have an opinion. I was just supposed to tell the people that reported to me and sell it to them if they didn't like it. So my job was to get them on board. That's a very passive approach, very command and control. Now, we might think that's a bad approach, and in many places it might not be the best approach, but there are situations when it makes most sense. Like if there's some emergency, if we were all in a meeting room and suddenly the fire alarm went off and a fire marshal came through the door and said, everybody evacuate out of the left door, not the right door, because it's blocked. That's a good time to take the expert's advice. It's not a good time to pause and have a focus group because the consequences of delay could be fatal. There's also consultation. And consultation implies, to me at least, that there's a decision maker who will make a decision. They will listen to the views of other people, but they may or may not actually act on them. So when there's a consultation, the views are solicited, but that may or may not actually affect the outcome. Engagement is more two-way. This is probably where we normally aim for in projects. It's actually having people involved, they're feeding in, and the project is feeding back, and we're bouncing ideas around and innovating. Beyond that, there's arguably even participation, where people actually come onto the project and they become part of it, and they it's co-created. At the extreme other end, there's what might be called self-mobilization, self-organizing teams. People who don't need to wait for a project initiation document, they just do it. They change a process. Personally, I don't think I've ever, in a work context, seen self-mobilization, but I've seen it in a lot of voluntary groups I've worked on, where, if it's just a group of people who are having a meet-up, and they decide, well, actually, let's do a fishbowl rather than a presentation next month. Well, you just do it because nobody's in control. And on reflection, I was a while back thinking about projects and programs, and how certainly the programs and projects I've been involved with, nobody's ever thought, or nobody's ever consciously thought, as far as I know, about where on that spectrum our stakeholder engagement should be, whether we just need to be passive, or whether we go for self-mobilization. And maybe we think of it like a spectrum, a slider. There's no wrong place on there, but we ought to be thinking about what's right for the context and the stakeholders and the project. It also, of course, impacts power, because if there is a situation where passive approaches are relevant, then that implies you have power over the folks that are, which might not actually be the case. Whereas the further to the right of that you get, the more power is actually being delegated to people who are affected by the change. And that's, again, a very, very good thing in many cases, but that does require management or leaders to actually be okay with properly delegating. The worst thing, and we've probably all seen it, is where someone delegates in name only. They say they're delegating power, but they still want to sign off on everything. Well, that's not engagement. That's not interactive participation. That isn't delegation. That's a sort of shadow, passive or consultation type of thing. And we should call that out. We should be, brave and call those things out, in my view. So we talk about tricky stakeholders. I open with that crazy story about the car and different stakeholder perspectives existing, and the fact that IT was imposed on those poor receptionists and the mechanics, which wasn't working for them, which led to a doom loop where mistakes were made, which created even more work. We've talked about stakeholders and stakes, building it for Bernard or Bernadette, understanding there's more variety out there in the stakeholder community than we necessarily initially think about. So we talked about analysing that with our interest impact grid, also a stakeholder rainbow, and a vested interest intensity index. We built upon that with perspectives with our PQR formula and our 3 E's, building up almost a mini persona of the situation. Where there's conflict, we said we can go even further and use cognitive mapping, like everyone having a different piece of the puzzle. and sort of, between us having enough. And there's lots more in all of these techniques. I should say I'm using the cognitive mapping approach slightly out of its normal context, but as a BA practitioner, I kind of find it useful to borrow from other professions from time to time. So just before we close, or I hand back to Raina and we see if there's any questions or any further discussions, I wanted to end where we began, because some of you might be wondering, what did I do about my car? Because, I told you the story, I scrapped the car, and this was my car, and I decided, it's ironic, isn't it? I'm a business analyst, I do all sorts of analysis in my day job, but then I was just going to go to a solution, I was just going to buy another car. And I looked at the situation as an analyst would and said, well, I live an 8-minute walk from a train station. I drive on average once every 2 weeks, if not even less frequently than that. I don't need a car, or I don't need to own a car. So one of my new cars looks like this. It turns out when I looked, because I understood my own my own perspective, my own needs as a stakeholder. There's a car club. There are 2 cars parked about a 10 or 15-minute walk away from my house, but I can hire by the hour. They're serviced, they're maintained by Enterprise, they're bookable by an app, you can pick them up 24/7, and not only that, there's a guaranteed parking space to return them to, which in the city I live in, that's a bonus, because parking's a real challenge. And it was only by thinking about my own perspectives as a stakeholder that I was able to create a different option. And that's another element to this. When we understand our perspectives and other perspectives, we can create new options that might not have been on the table if we didn't explicitly make explicit those mental models and those expectations. So a final ponder point, a final challenge I'd like to set for anyone listening to this, whether you're listening live or on the recording, is which stakeholder is missing from the project or initiative that you're working on right now? And more importantly, what can we, as an enthusiastic and empowered community of change professionals, do to help avoid that and ensure that we build diversity and inclusion into our initiatives from the very, very beginning? And with that, I will say thank you very much, and I will hand back to Raina.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Adrian. That was really impressive. So I'm thinking a lot. My brain is working in all directions. And but before I come up with my own questions, or even in parallel, I would ask the audience to ask questions. Please put your questions in the chat box, or give me a hand, so that I can even switch on your mic if you want to ask a question verbally. This is not a problem. Okay, before the people are coming with questions, there are already coming some, yes. Yeah. What does that mean, to stop bad parking? Okay. Okay. Yeah. So what I wanted to say is this slider. It deeply impressed me. So because this, how can you put this slider together with the term motivation?
That's a really interesting question, and I'll just find the slide. So just 2 seconds. So this slide here, and I think it's a really interesting point around motivation, because there's the type of engagement or interaction that a project or organization wants with its stakeholders. But there's also whether the stakeholders themselves actually care enough to be engaged or, consulted in the way that the organization intends, and whether they're motivated. So this, again, coming back to a local council or a government, I mean, in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same for many other places, you can go and attend consultations and meetings and city councils, and I do because they interest me, and very few people do. And that to me implies that there's work to be done in communicating why it's such an important thing to be involved with. And particularly if we're on the right-hand side of the slider, if we're wanting to get real participation, then what we need to do is understand those groups enough to say, this is why we value this is why we value you, and this is why we think, this is the benefit to you of taking part. Because without that motivation, then things will fizzle out. It's a really, really tricky question, Rainer, but a really, really good one.
Yes, because motivated stakeholder, they are quite easy. They work with passion, and if you have to, let's say, the contradicting stakeholders, the people who have probably a negative passion, probably who are people who are kind of disappointed by command and control initiatives, then the motivation can really go down. And this is so. I think motivation is a kind of second perspective or second dimension of this slider, probably.
That's really interesting, Rainer. And maybe when we're at the conference in May, we can get around a whiteboard and draw it, because maybe it's like a two-way axis. That would be really interesting.
Yes, exactly. This is what I was thinking about. But I got a question. How would you, as a BA, deal with conflicting perspectives from stakeholders? So, what can you do if you have contradicting opinions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a reality that we all feel. So I think it's a fantastic question. And I think I'll give a classic BA answer, then I'll answer more fully. But I think the classic BA answer is it depends, because it depends on whose perspective it is. I think more generally, the most important thing we can do is highlight the fact that different perspectives exist. Because I look back on some of the early projects I worked on early in my career, what I now recognise as a personal reflection is it sounded like people agreed, but it's because I wasn't asking questions deeply enough. And one of the reasons that I find the 3 E's so useful is it highlights, like, stakeholders themselves start to see that they're not agreeing. And then that enables us to cultivate a conversation about, what do we do here? Because we've got 3 slightly different perspectives, and it's quite possible to then almost hit the pause button to talk it through, and either come up with like what's sometimes called an accommodation, so everyone at least can live with the outcome.
To accommodate.
Or escalate if we need to. I mean, I would always avoid that where we can, but escalation might be the route we have to take.
Yeah, sounds a bit like trying to achieve a compromise. Sometimes can be a solution, one of the solutions.
Exactly. Yeah.
So another one, I read it out because it's a long one. UX and service design is one of those areas that is looking to consider more low-influence people in process design.
Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned personas. If you are working with a UXer, how do you split your stakeholder management?
Oh, that is such a good question. And so I think there's the splitting the stakeholder management, and there's also the splitting the work in the UX folk. And I've worked with some fantastic UX people. I think it's a really, really good discipline. And I've learned a lot by working with UXers. But the trouble is, or the pitfall is, they're really thinking about what they might call user needs or customer needs. And you think about what is a requirement. Well, a requirement, I think the BA box definition is it's a usable representation of a need.
Sure. Yeah.
So we're talking about very similar things from a different perspective. So I think the best way is to have the discussion up front with the UXer. And in terms of stakeholder management and stakeholder engagement specifically, I think it's got to be shared. But I would go as far as saying that isn't just the case with UX, it's also the reality of, say, BAs and project managers. Because I've worked in environments where it's been like, right, well, the project manager is responsible for stakeholder management. And I've been thinking, well, maybe, but actually everyone on this program is responsible for, everyone speaks to stakeholders.
Exactly.
And if we're not all on the same page, then it's going to crumble. So I think shared responsibility, but having the conversation up front will enable that. It'll be a crucial enabler, I think.
Yeah. So, but I can agree to that. So the influence or the impact on the project by UX people and the UX message should not be underestimated. That's very important, not to neglect the people. Finally, the end users who are in touch with the GUIs and who really feel the impact, and that's why UX is so important. So I have a final question, because we are running out of time. We have exactly 1700, 5 o'clock. How do you convince the high influence, least affected stakeholders, so meaning the sponsors, or something like that, to listen to the voice of the stakeholders of the most affected? So how do you establish a communication between this upper left corner and the bottom right corner?
Yeah, again, great question. Really, really fundamental question. And I'm not sure I've ever found a right or a universal way of doing this, but I think it's interesting. I think high power, high influence people are often very, very outcome focused at the high level. And the reality is most projects won't deliver their benefits if the needs of the people who are actually operating the services or systems, or are benefiting from them, if it's like a resident or a citizen, if it's a government project. Like if it doesn't meet their needs, it won't work. So the line I would tend to use there is, actually, if we don't involve those people, they'll just find a way of working around this, and we will have wasted a bunch of money delivering something that is worse than what is there today. And there are plenty of examples. There's probably examples in every organisation of that happening. So I would say it's about making the connection between the outcomes, the things that those people care about, and that clear line of sight that if we involve these people, you are far more likely to get those outcomes than if we don't involve them.
Yes. Even if a project is fine from the numbers point of view, even if the financial outcome is okay and the budget has been capped and the timeline is fine. So if the effect is not felt by the end users, by the right bottom users, then it might be pointless what has been produced.
This is it, and just an additional point, I absolutely agree, and I think one additional aspect of this, and it depends on the organisation whether this is considered relevant, but I consider it, personally, as a practice, we consider it very relevant, is sometimes, we shouldn't lose sight, I don't believe, of ethics, and sometimes it is the right thing to do to engage people whose voices aren't always heard. And I'm certainly never afraid to say that. In that, it's ethically the right thing to do. Now that might not always be listened to, but at least I can sleep well at night knowing I've tried.
I can. That's exactly what I meant. It's you always should think about for whom are we doing this project? What do we want to achieve? So brilliant, Adrian. I like these discussions, and it could even go longer. But of course, we have to keep the schedule. And I really want to say a big thank you to you. It was really fun, and hopefully it was fun for the people as well. So you can see Adrian's contact on the screen, so don't hesitate to contact him. And probably you can join other webinars which are coming
Yes.
Go on www.masVenta.de. There we have Almudena Rodriguez Pardo. In a couple of days, she's talking on a new role, a new kid on the block, which is RTE, the Release Train Engineer in the safe world. Very interesting topic as well. It's a new role. Let's say another guy besides the product owner and the scrum masters who are quite known already. And finally, please consider to come to Frankfurt to the Business Analysis Day, because there you can meet all these people. You can meet Adrian, you can meet all Almudena, and you can even meet people coming from America, from Australia. So we have Howard Podeswa. He's written some really acknowledged books, and Casey Burkage from Australia, and a lot of really knowledgeable, prominent people with a lot of nice and interesting speeches and presentations. So again, thank you, Adrian. Have a nice day, and greetings to all people out there.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Stay safe and see you later.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.